We are going to continue our discussion of vertical systems going into the somatosensory system. So this module includes 3 chapters, chapters 10, 11, and 12. There's a lot of information in them, but don't let that be a daunting aspect to you. We're getting into a really exciting part of the body, really exciting part of the nervous system, and so stick with me and we'll get through it. So we talked about really the information in the first 3 modules was really sort of the introductory information that applies all over the place. Then we started into the autonomic nervous system for the getting more into the vertical tract system. Now we're going into the somatosensory system. So the autonomic nervous system, we can say, oh yeah, that goes on in the background. We're not really aware of it for the most part. But the somatosensation, we are largely aware of it. There is some non-conscious information that gets transmitted, but there's a lot of conscious information too. So our sense of touch and temperature and pressure and that sort of thing. So the somatosensory system becomes very interesting to us because we are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. Basically, the processing in our central nervous system, if you look at the overall big picture, we're going to get some sort of sensory information coming in. It's going to be processed in the spinal cord in the brain. And then the brain's going to say, okay, we need to deal with this, and it's going to send out a motor response, and then the motor system will take over. So that's sort of our big picture. So now we're looking at the first slice of that picture, the sensation type. So sensation allows us to see what's going on around us in the world. It allows us to move more accurately and to avoid or minimize injuries. So you can't take your foot out of the fire if you don't feel the temperature and you feel that it's hot. You also can't do it without the motor system, but that's the other half of the response. So we're going to start at the sensory system, we're going to work our way up to the brain, and then we're going to go into the motor system. Kind of just like our nerve impulses do in real life. Kind of interesting, right? So all of the pathways that convey somatosensory information to the cerebral cortex have a similar arrangement. They all use a 3-neuron pathway, and we'll talk about that specifically, to get from the periphery to the brain. So basically the first order neuron brings the information in from the receptors. The second order neuron conveys information from the spinal cord to the midbrain, the thalamus. And the third order neuron conveys the information from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So we're going to talk about the first part of that in this chapter. And then in chapter 11, we're going to talk about the second and third part of that. So the receptors are where we're going to start with the somatosensory system. First, I want to go over some learning objectives. So you should define the following terminology, and this is for really, the terminology spans across chapter 10 and 11. Stereognosis, I would like you to know the definition of that. We'll talk about it. Dermatome and tract. We encountered dermatomes when we were doing sensory testing in lab last summer. We want to know what the primary function of the somatosensory system is. We want to be able to classify the 6 types of sensory neurons, 1A, 1B, 2, A beta, A delta, and C, and we want to be able to classify them by size, type of receptors, level of myelination, and the type of information that's transmitted. So we've met 3 of these guys before. A beta, A delta, and C fibers. We met those last quarter in modalities class. So the A beta are those sensory fibers that have a potential to close the gate at the spinal cord. The A deltas are those sharp, fast pain fibers, and the C deltas are those slow pain fibers, or the C's, sorry. So A beta, A delta, and C, we're already familiar with those guys, and then we get to meet 1A, 1B, and 2 in this chapter. So I want you to be able to compare them by size, which is the biggest, which is the smallest. There's some great tables in the book that do that. I want you to know what the functional significance of axon diameter is. So is a bigger axon is going to be faster, a smaller axon is going to be slower, and we'll talk more about that as well. I want you to be able to name the stimulus for the following sensory receptors: mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and nociceptors. 3 of those, mechano, chemo, and thermoreceptors, give you the stimulus in their name. And we'll talk more about those. I want you to know which receptors bring the information from the sensory system to be used in proprioception or body sense. So which receptors are contributing to body sense the most? And then I also want you to know where the cell bodies of the primary somatosensory receptor neurons are located. And like I said a little bit earlier, the somatosensory pathways are all very similar in their anatomic arrangement. So their cell bodies are all in the same place. So somatosensation is our sensory information from the skin and the musculoskeletal systems. Information from the skin is also known as cutaneous sensation. It's superficial. That's our touch, our pain, our temperature sensation. Information from the musculoskeletal system includes proprioception and also pain. So we have different pain receptors, as we've talked about before, and those pain receptors we will discuss in depth. You can think of them as danger receptors. So they are letting our central nervous system know there is something that's a potential threat to us and we might need to deal with it. So then it gets processed and the brain gets to decide, do we need to deal with it? Is it really a threat? Am I going to produce pain? So pain, even though that we call those pain receptors, those nociceptors, pain is actually produced by the brain. The brain gets to decide whether it's going to produce pain or not. So the information in the somatosensory system goes from the receptor through that series of 3 neurons to the brain. The first order neuron is that distal part. It's the sensory axon that goes into the dorsal root of the spinal cord. The second order neuron goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus in the midbrain, the diencephalon. And the third order neuron goes from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So we have to have all those 3 parts in order for it to get to the brain, in order for us to perceive anything. So the peripheral sensory nerves, the peripheral sensory neurons, what they do is they collect information. They're not going to produce any results until it gets processed either in the spinal cord or both the spinal cord and the brain. So the peripheral sensory neurons, their job is to encode information from a mechanical or physical phenomenon into a neural impulse. So really that's what those peripheral nerves are all about. They're encoding that information. So whether we're talking about the somatosensory system or the autonomic system or the vestibular system or any other system, the first order neuron, its job is to encode some kind of data into a neural impulse that then our brain can understand and analyze. Very interesting, that encoding process. So the speed of information processing is determined by the diameter of the axons. A larger axon is faster. A smaller axon is slower. The degree of axonal myelination, the more myelinated the axon is, the faster it is. The less myelinated it is, the slower it is. And the number of synapses in the pathway. So sensory information from the skin is called cutaneous sensation, and we know that there are 3, it's a 3 neuron pathway, and so we have those synapses leading up. You can think of the number of synapses in the pathway as sort of like how many stops on your airplane trip. So if you say I'm going to Tucson and I'm searching for a flight, and I see one that has 3 stops and one that is non-stop, Well, I'm going to pick the nonstop one because I want to get there faster. So the speed of my travel is going to be determined by the number of airports that I have to go through. So I'm picking the least number of connections so I can get there faster. It's the same distance from point A to point B, but more connections make it a slower trip. So a lot of times transportation analogies work really well for nervous system things. As some of you found when you were doing your events in the synapse assignment, sports analogies work really well a lot of times. The analogy always breaks down at some point, but coming up with an analogy is a good way to help you remember those complex concepts. So I do like analogies.